this afternoon we are going to do another super read, and we are going to finish Unashamed by LECREA. Christian rapper, and if you are able to hear the music in the background, this is his music that's being played as of right now. So, if you are liking the music, I would highly recommend you listen to it on Spotify or YouTube, which is what I have it on right now. So, without further ado, this is basically a testimony of his life as a Christian before he was Christian and his life while he was Christian. But without further ado, let us finish Unashamed by LECREA. Chapter 10. And what happens when Outcast meets the writings of Moses? The views are opposing, but they correlate, and me and Christ don't match, but we coordinate. If Wu-Tang can spit 5% gems, I can talk about him who died for my sins. I'm not a gospel rapper. I'm not a holy roller. I'm just a product of grace, spreading hope to the hopeless. Art is nothing if not a reflection of the artist. My worldview had transformed. It was only a matter of time before the music followed. I was mostly making music for Christians in the early days. Over time, some subgroups developed. There were Christian kids from urban contexts, and there were conservative evangelical Christians from the suburbs. And there were Reformed Christians who liked me because their favorite theologian or pastor gave me his stamp of approval. But in the end, the fans were almost all Christians. Nothing is inherently wrong with making art for a specific audience, and in my case, it worked out pretty well. I allowed my prophetic side to come out, telling the truth about matters when others were afraid to speak up. Even though my self-righteousness was getting in the way, people could smell the authenticity and passion. Lives were being changed. But the more I discerned my calling, the more convinced I was that God didn't want me to just make music for the church. Christian culture was never in my DNA anywhere. I wasn't raised in it. I didn't know it. I never felt fully comfortable in it. I wasn't some church kid who was trying to be hip-hop because it was cool. I was a kid who grew up in hip-hop, who was making music as a Christian. I had a heart for reaching people who were far from God. Even my misguided attempts at evangelism hinted at that. But the music was never coming into contact with those people. Outside of the church, I didn't exist. I was invisible. It occurred to me that even if people outside the church were to stumble upon my music, they probably didn't dismiss it. They wouldn't understand the theological language that I was inserting to please Christian leaders. They would have smelled the self-righteousness and how I was always the song's hero. The be better, do better, work harder messages in the music would never transform them. The gospel naturally offends those outside of the faith. But I wanted people to be loved, not guilted into following Jesus. In addition to sensing a call to reach people inside and outside the church, everything I was learning was pushing me to influence the broader society. I remember reading a story about how Christians built some of the first professional hospitals. They saw a need, and they addressed it. By creating something new, they were on the cutting edge of transforming the way humans thought about healthcare. How could this way of thinking change the way I was creating my art? For years I'd lived in communities drowning in social problems and sin. Fatherlessness, sexism, racism, poverty, violence. These communities were filled with people who didn't know how to deal with their emotions, didn't understand systematic oppression, and weren't being educated on basic economics and personal finance. I loved going on mission trips. I loved mentoring kids and repairing old ladies' houses. I loved meeting needs in the hood. But my music one of the greatest assets for impacting culture, never came into contact with the world outside of the church. It was like I was cleaning up the oil spill when I should have been climbing onto the tanker and plugging a hole. The music gave me an opportunity to get upstream of culture and produce art with messages that could shape the broader society. Yet most of the music was doing nothing to improve the problems I was witnessing. At its best, my music was trying to push Christians to live right. By God's grace, some people were coming to faith through the music, but there was nothing in it to inspire them to apply their faith to the world's complex problems. I had been focused on behavior modification, not worldview transformation. So there I was, a musician in the midst of troubled urban culture, failing to properly use the gifts God gave me to address the problems around me. As I prayed about what God wanted for the next season of my life, I began to feel that God was not just wanting to change me as a person, but He also wanted to move me to a new place. I considered Philadelphia and Los Angeles and New York City, but something kept drawing me toward Atlanta. Hip-hop coming out of different cities has its own distinct sound, often unrecognizable to the untrained ear. My music had always had a southern feel, so Atlanta seemed like a good fit. Additionally, I wanted to go to a place where culture was being shaped. When it came to hip-hop, few cities were more influential than Atlanta. The problem with a lot of popular hip-hop is that it often glorifies the worst aspects of humanity. It can celebrate violence, even murder. It sometimes promotes misogynistic attitudes and the objectification of women. It can devalue education, glorify sex, and idolize wealth. It's difficult to completely blame these artists. Many are just singing what they know and creating what people are consuming. But I began to dream about what it might mean if a different brand of hip-hop artists were to exist in the same space. While creating music with alternative values, in a matter of months, Dara and I were packing our belongings into cardboard boxes and preparing to relocate. Moving to a new place wouldn't automatically transform the music. I needed to unchain my creative side, not just to evangelize, but to paint an alternative picture of the world that was both saturated by the gospel and accessible enough for anyone. As I dreamed, fear crept in. The voices in my head began to taunt me, to tell me not to follow my calling. They said that my Christian fans wouldn't understand, that they would abandon me. When this didn't stick, the voices began to speak to my insecurities and lifelong struggle for acceptance. They told me that non-Christian audiences would never accept me, not as an artist. I wasn't good enough to make music for the masses, the voices said. Even if I was, the music would never influence culture. I was confident enough in God's calling to beat back the voices of doubt and despair. But when the voices disappeared, all I heard was silence. I had spent years producing another kind of art. I could do it in my sleep. But now I didn't know what to write. I'd sit and stare at blank pages. I wanted to be vulnerable, but the thought of expressing myself this way left me paralyzed. For months, I felt stuck in a dark place with my hands tied. But one day, I decided to sit down and just write. Whatever came to mind, whatever I was feeling, whatever I was wrestling with, I couldn't see the way forward. But I decided to start walking anyway. And out of the darkness, a new kind of album was birthed.
My mind is not right.
The house was empty the day I started to write again. My family was running errands, so it was more quiet than normal. There was barely any furniture except a wooden kitchen table where I sat and stared at a blank page. I had learned so much about how to be an effective Christian that I had forgotten how to be an effective songwriter. Creating the music requires more than hard work and perseverance. It needs a spark, a flash, a flame to kindle the creative process. Just right, LECREA. I had just released what many of my fans felt was one of my best albums, Rubber. It was full of strong, bold, and challenging content. Its quality was on par with current hip-hop, due to the contributions of some of the most talented producers I know. Joseph Osney and Gabriel Gavi Azucena just start writing. To write Rebel, I had gone back to San Diego to write most of the album, so I could feel connected with my roots and the common struggles of humanity. The album struck a chord with most of the listeners, and many have said it's one of the albums that helped shape their lives. Still, there were only a couple of transparent and relatable songs that connected to a world outside of Christian circles. Write whatever comes to mind. I had been stuck for so long. I just started writing about what being stuck felt like. The frustration, the silence, the darkness. As my hands moved, words started coming to me, but slowly. It was like greasing the gears of a machine that's been sitting idle. If you listen to one of the first songs I wrote, Wish It Wasn't True, you can feel me struggling to get the words out. I know I just got out of rehab, but I actually need to be checked back in. Yeah, I didn't think this was gonna happen to me, man. I feel like I'm back in that dark place, somewhere in between a rock and a hard place. And I ain't doing nothing bad. I'm just doing bad, feeling empty when I got more than I done ever had. So I'm gonna do what I do best when I feel depressed. Go ahead and let my pen bleed out the stress. Bleeding was a more accurate metaphor than I even realized at the time. God was pushing me to be real and let the true LECREA spill into the lyrics. No more walls, no more holding back, no more guarding myself, no more casting myself as the hero, no more acting like I had it all together. As I let go of pride and pretenses, the momentum increased. Soon, a different and deeper kind of music poured out of me. The breakout song on the album, Background, admitted that I am sometimes tempted by the spotlight. I said that I don't deserve fame and glory, only God does. One song, Killa, even confessed my battle with lust. Walking to my grave, letting evilness enslave me. Evil looks so lovely, covered in her lace of lies, and this silky smooth seduction just manipulates my mind. Her fabric of fabrication is fueling my fascination. While I'm intoxicated, she starts her assassination. I'm losing all my honor and my years the merciless, giving all my life away, but I'm just so immersed in this. Writing the album felt like being stuck in that empty hospital room, seeking God for direction and scribbling with a crayon. I titled the album Rehab, not just because it reminded me of that vulnerable period in my life, but also because it expressed my deep need for personal, spiritual, and musical rehabilitation. Rehab confessed my own self-righteousness and declared that I was unashamed of Jesus. Yes. But I'm also unashamed to admit my weaknesses, unashamed to admit my brokenness, unashamed to admit that I fail constantly and need help. Most of the fans stuck with me through rehab. Looking back, the album still had the residue of the Christian subculture on it and was littered with Christianese. It fit solidly in the contemporary Christian music genre, and it had a sort of pop sensibility that made it accessible. But even though it didn't totally line up with my new worldview, it was still a huge step forward in terms of authenticity. I was finally comfortable with being weak and imperfect in the music. I think of it almost as an artistic bridge between who I was and who I am. The problem with bridges is that they get walked on from both sides. Secular critics didn't understand it because it felt so Christian. And many of my core Christian fans didn't understand it because it wasn't preachy. They were used to me playing the pastor rapper role, Killa, never directly mentioned God or Jesus. And neither did background. So I lost some fans after the album released. But I was confident I was moving in the direction God was calling. And I was also sure that this was only the beginning. The authenticity of Rehab caught the attention of some mainstream influencers, and in 2011, I was invited to participate in the Bet Cypher. This is an event in conjunction with the Bet Hip Hop Awards, where some of the best young artists gathered to rap 16 bars and show off their talent. Those familiar with hip hop know that this can make or break an artist. The cypher took place in a warehouse in Brooklyn, and I didn't have much time to prepare. On the flight up, and the hours preceding it, I was sweating. What would I say to the mainstream audience who wasn't familiar with me or my music? This was a watershed moment, so I knew I couldn't just spit a few lyrical bars like everyone else. Sure, I wanted to have a good delivery, but I also wanted to show people that you can be good at your craft and true to your faith at the same time. I wanted to show them that I was different, but I didn't want to shove Jesus down their throats. I eventually decided to just rap what I felt. You're probably watching like, man, I never heard of him. I'll murder him. The nerve of him. Rocking with Premier. That's so absurd of him. Wait until you spit a couple of verbs at them. If you really want to hate, wait. We got the word with him. I heard him holla Jesus, the most glorious homie. Some Christians who saw it weren't happy with me for using a notorious B.I.G. reference to talk about Jesus and for giving a nod to DJ Premier. Was produced for most of the mainstream hip-hop's elite artists. But I had just taken the same approach that the Apostle Paul did in Acts 17. Our situations weren't that different. Paul had been invited to speak in the Areopagus, a place where all of the influential voices in his day gathered to trade ideas. In explaining what he believed, Paul used the language of culture and referenced their popular poets. I used the language of hip-hop, which I had spoken fluently since I was a kid, and I referenced some of our most prominent poet rappers. When I flew home afterward, I felt at peace with my performance. We had moved to Atlanta, and I started forming friendships with lots of non-Christian people. I struggled at first. I hadn't engaged with many non-Christians since coming to faith, except to argue with them about how sinful they were. Figuring out how to be friends with people who didn't believe in Jesus without compromising my beliefs was a process. I slowly learned how to love non-Christians without pushing them away. These relationships opened me up artistically, and I began to feel it was time to take another step forward. I received a random phone call one day from a college friend named Street Symphony. We had lost touch, but he had gone on to become a producer and worked with mainstream artists from LECREA to Rick Ross. Street told me that he had been swept up into the entertainment industry and the world of expensive cars, sex, and drugs. He felt empty. At some point, Street came across my music, and he thought I might be able to help him think through life. He started wrestling with big questions about God and meaning. I would tell him what I believed, and then let him work through what he believed. Over time, he saw that I wasn't full of judgment and condemnation. Like a lot of Christians he knew, I wanted the best for him and was willing to let him see my spiritual shortcomings. Before long, Street became a Christian himself. The more time Street and I spent together, the more we talked about collaborating on something in the studio. He knew I felt called to produce music for more than just Christians, and one day he had a crazy idea. I should make a mixtape and give it away for free. Street believed that many people could benefit from the music, but never come into contact with it in our current model. My music was
Here in New Zealand, the sun is shining,
yeah.
but it doesn't just brighten.
Where was I? Oh yeah. Street believed that many people could benefit from the music, but could never come into contact with it in our current model. My music was only known among Christians. Street said that a Christian artist can't just put out an album and expect non-Christians to buy it. He wanted to take the route that the broader rap community takes when trying to gain exposure. Drop a mixtape, give it away for free, allow people to taste and see what we were doing. This was our best chance to get the music pumping in the streets. The idea made me nervous. I didn't know how people would respond, but it felt authentic to who I was. Street had a relationship with one of the biggest DJs in hip-hop, DJ Don Cannon, who was eager to join us and host the project. The next step was to actually write it. I sat down, took a deep breath, and let the music flow out of me. I could see the faces of the people I was writing to in my mind. They looked different than before. I was no longer envisioning the mega church pastors I wanted to accept me, and I wasn't picturing the fans who would look up to me because I had figured it all out. Now I was seeing people like me in streets, people who grew up in the hood, who faced serious problems at too young an age, people who were surrounded by all sorts of sin, people who needed hope and encouragement and truth in the gospel. I started talking to people instead of at people. The result was a mixtape we called Church Clothes. The lyrics were stripped of most of the Christianese that shackled my previous music. Even rehab. Rather than try to preach at people, the songs dealt with real problems head on. In Cold War, I talked about the difficulties of living in a broken world of poverty and violence. One song, The Price of Life, dealt with rampant materialism. She camouflaged her insecurity in Jimmy Choo's. High heels, but the mountaintop she'll never choose. She'll settle for a dude in precious metals, a slave to his money, but his change you can tell it. Church Clothes was more than just an honest album. In some ways, the album was the definitive declaration of my new direction. I was proclaiming that the music I was committed to making was for all people. I was declaring that I was no longer striving to be Christianity's golden child or get a pat on the back from religious celebrities. I was going to have the conversations I felt God calling me to curate. I was going to tell real and raw stories and let the chips fall where they may. In this way, Church Clothes was a manifesto of who I felt God had called me to be. A hip-hop artist who is a Christian, but doesn't fit inside a box. I had always been a truth teller, but now I was speaking in a way that made sense to people outside of the church of the Christian faith, too. The title track was even written from the perspective of a non-Christian. It talked about hypocrisy and corrupt pastors and gay choir members who are stuck in the closet. The honesty resonated, and the mixtape blew up on that piss. It was downloaded more than 100,000 times in the first 48 hours. The traffic overloaded their servers and crashed the website. 250,000 people snatched it up by the end of the month. We were all shocked. But while the music was surging, some of my Christian fans were confused by the new direction. Looking back, I should have been more explicit with what God was leading me to do. My silence left my longtime fans in the dark about the evolution of the music. The dam of their frustration broke less than a year later when I released my next studio album, Gravity, which pushed even further. I even teamed up with mainstream rapper Big Crit on one of the tracks. Some thought I had gone too far. Former fans wrote hateful things about me on blogs. They labeled me a sellout and a fake. Some attacked my personally, even questioning whether I was really a Christian. Some people contacted venues and tours to get me banned from performing. Crowds started showing up to protest my concerts. People were posting YouTube videos and condemning me to Hades, and even suggesting I had joined the Illuminati. I was being criticized in public for the first time in my career, and I didn't know how to manage it. I was angry and hurt at first. I protested in prayer. If these are your people, God, I don't want to be like them. I even flipped out to my wife, screaming about how betrayed I felt. I was just trying to follow God's calling on my life, I told her. I was still unashamed of my faith. That hadn't changed. But now I was being bold with my art. Why were people attacking me? My wise wife encouraged me to get off social media and spend time with God. I knew she was right. I grabbed a few books, my Bible, and locked myself in my closet. I read a biography of Francis Schaeffer, a Christian thinker who showed the world what it meant to live with a Christian worldview. Schaeffer knew what being criticized felt like, and it drove him to make sure he knew what he believed too. Reading Schaeffer sent me back once again to the Gospels. I read about how Jesus' heart for the world incited the anger of the religious community, but it never stopped him from doing what he believed the Father was calling him to do, even if it meant laying his livelihood and his life on the altar. If religious people wanted to crucify me for trying to reach the non-religious, I concluded I was in pretty good company. I emerged from my closet with a new confidence and peace. And a few days later, I had a conversation with Pastor Rick Warren that confirmed everything God had been saying. If you're going to call the shots, LECREA, you're going to have to take them too, he told me. For every 1,000 people you influence, you'll have 100 critics. And many of them will call themselves Christian. That just comes with the territory. Once again, I committed to die to the acceptance of men, to refocus all my attention on God's glory and His calling on my life. I had learned to be unashamed. I have learned to be unashamed in the midst of a fallen world. Now I needed to learn to be unashamed in the midst of a religious world. I started to realize that Christian bloggers and critics will find a reason to scrutinize almost anything. At my first mainstream hip-hop festival, Paid Dues Festival in Los Angeles, I performed after Macklemore. At another festival, I performed alongside Wu-Tang Clan. People went out of their way to express frustrations at me sharing a stage with these secular artists. Some critics were angry that a YouTube video showed me rocking my head to profane music. But my critics almost lost their minds when they became aware of my friendship with Kendrick Lamar. But the critics didn't know the whole story. Critics almost never do. They claimed I had been seduced by the money. They didn't know that I was actually losing money at many of the mainstream events. The Christian world paid better and treated me like royalty, but I was paying out of my pocket to fly my crew out to some of the festivals because I was serious about being salt and light in these places. The critics said I was just chasing fame by trying to become friends with famous people. But they didn't know that I was an outsider at many of these events. I wasn't sacrificing my beliefs or seeking their acceptance. I wasn't smoking weed or going to the strip clubs with everyone else. The critics claimed I was a sellout for being friends with people like Kendrick. They were mad that I didn't call him for the profanity in his music. They didn't know that he and I were constantly dialoguing about faith. The critics hated that I was loving this community instead of attacking them. They didn't know that rappers would often come to find me after a show, sometimes high and out of their minds, and ask me to help figure out what God wanted for their lives. Critics always have a lot of fury, but they rarely have a lot of facts. By God's grace, the music was resonating with many despite the frustration of a few. Babe, Our mainstream fan base was growing, and many of the Christians who were initially confused by the new direction were starting to come around too. For everyone we lost, we gained 10 more. The question now was not whether the fans could handle the music, but whether I could handle my newfound success and all its temptations. And that's the end of chapter 10. Yeah, this chapter I don't think is too long. I wonder what this is. Alright, let's see. Okay, yeah, this is okay. Alright, chapter 11. We are the odd, the outcasts, the peculiar, the strangers, and they say we don't fit in. But I say, we are exactly who God created us to be. Anomalies. The system didn't plan for this. A dozen bulbs shine from around the border of the mirror. The light illuminates my face, allowing me to stare back at my reflection. The voices of a dozen friends standing behind me have faded. The room is silent as far as I am concerned. They say if you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. I'm about to find out if that old saying is true. It is April 9th, 2015, and I'm sitting in a backstage dressing room in the heart of Times Square. People lined up hours earlier to get into the Best Buy theater for the sold-out show tonight. A reporter with the New York Times is here to see the show for a story he's writing. Earlier in the day, I performed live on Good Morning America. Days before that, my music video premiered at halftime at a Brooklyn Nets game. These great opportunities are also incredible temptations. 2,000 years ago, the Apostle John wrote, "For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world." Not much has changed in 2 millennia. Achieving what the world calls success has taught me that these are still 3 of the world's main temptations. The desires of the flesh are the physical pleasures that fallen humans crave, namely lust and sex. Early in my career, women were very respectful because they respected what I was about and what I stood for. But as the music became more mainstream, I attracted fans who just liked the sound of the music rather than its message. So female fans got more flirtatious. On tour, beautiful women would walk past me, wink, and then slip their phone number into my pocket. On social media, fans would tweet that I am the man of their dreams and that they will do anything to be with me. But the ones who are slick and sly about it are the most dangerous. Women would come up and try to connect with me professionally. Some would just hand me their card and ask me to call them for a business opportunity. I could usually tell the vibe was off. I learned quickly to set up safeguards against the desires of my flesh. When women handed me a card, I'd pass it to my manager. When women hand me a phone number, I immediately give them to the guys who look out for me on the road, and they shred them. The desires of their eyes are a craving for everything we see. It is the desire for stuff. When you're in the entertainment industry, you're surrounded by the finer things of life. People pick you up in $300,000 Bentley convertibles and invite you to sail their yachts.
I am here to tell you today
There is
that
always
your
a glamorous
feelings
party
are
happening
valid. Your trauma
somewhere,
is valid.
and
Your
each
hurt
seems
is
to be
valid.
more
I discovered them
over the
about
top
2
than
years
the
ago,
last.
and my life
I grew accustomed to these things over time, even though I knew I didn't need them. I was traveling all the time and always getting upgraded on flights. When I didn't, I would wrestle internally. I'd do a few performances in a row where they put me up at expensive hotels, and then I'd struggle to be appreciative when another event put me in a 2-star hotel. When we performed at theme parks, I'd be escorted to the front of the lines, and then I'd have to work to be patient when I had to wait to ride a roller coaster. You know your heart is in trouble when luxuries become expectations. Early on, I had to repent of the way I was falling to this temptation. I knew if I followed this path, it would wrap me. I started doing music to serve people, not to have people serve me. I wanted the music to produce transformed lives, not trophies. As the music spread, I prayed more often than God would keep me humble and true to my calling. What, well, what does it profit a rapper to gain the whole world and lose his soul? The decisions I have made in my professional life have helped me resist the temptations I face in my professional life. I was lucky early in my career, and I was given wise counsel to cap my salary and live below my means. Money itself isn't evil, but the love of it is the root of all kinds of evil. So these things helped me to stay grounded. I began realizing that people on yachts weren't happier than people in rowboats. Bentleys break down just like Nissans. You can get a great night's sleep in a Hampton Inn just like at a Ritz-Carlton. And flying the first class won't get you to your destination any faster than riding in coach. Actually, the lesser things in life often end up being the better things in life, because they build character. Those with character are usually those who leave a lasting mark on the world. And whoever dies with the most stuff still dies. So it is an empty ambition, as I wrote in Confessions. I've flown first class, flown private jets, rode in the foreign cars, still so unimpressed. But if you find identity in it, then go and forget it. You gain the whole world, but lost the only thing you own, because everything else is just a temporary loan. John's third temptation, the pride of life, is the desire to root our identity in achievement. The real problem with success is not that you are accomplishing great things. It's that people are constantly telling you how great you are. You deserve more, they say, or with your talent you should be paid better, or you're better than this LECREA. Because of my background, success is a deadly viper. That should be handled with care. I still battle the desire for acceptance. Sometimes every day. There can be 10,000 adoring fans at my show. But the two people who trashed me online will often dominate my thoughts. I've forgotten that the two don't matter, and neither do the 10,000. It only matters what the one thinks. My desire for acceptance is one of the crosses that I carry. Each morning, I have to attend a funeral, my own. I have to wake up and once again die to my desires for people's approval. Competition is at the heart of the pride of life. But as a follower of Jesus, I have to remember that success is not what I've done compared with what others have done. Success is what I've done compared to what God has called me to do. By learning to exist in culture while resisting the temptations of culture, I was forced to face a different type of temptation, the pressure to conform. In the months leading up to my performance in Times Square, the music penetrated the mainstream masses like never before. Rehab broke into the top 20 on the Billboard Top 200 charts and earned a Grammy nomination. Gravity charted at number 3 on Billboard and actually won a Grammy, but my latest album, Anomaly, debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200 and won a Grammy after being nominated for 3. This catapulted me into a new arena where I was being profiled by Time and XXL and being invited to perform on big stages at places like South by Southwest. The mainstream success brought a new set of challenges with it. Popular musicians come into contact with all kinds of people. Some of them just want to use you. They make empty promises, trying to earn your trust so they can ride your wave. Others genuinely respect you, but the first type of person makes you skeptical. I wasn't sure who to trust or how to proceed. It was like leaving training camp and walking straight onto the football field and having someone hand me a ball while the 50,000 screaming fans wait to see which play I was going to run. There was pressure to become the person the mainstream wanted me to be. In a situation like this, you can expect the player to make some mistakes, and I made plenty. One of my biggest problems was that I didn't know how to navigate mainstream media interviews with big-time music outlets like BET, MTV, and Billboard. When people viewed or read my comments, they assumed I was just speaking from my heart, but my guard wasn't down. It was higher than ever. I had to be standing in front of journalists with adrenaline pumping through my veins and praying that I didn't mess up. It's not easy. They ask a tough question, and I'm trying to formulate a perfect answer on the spot. I remember one interview I did with Hard Knock TV, where I dropped the ball. I stumbled over my answers and didn't really articulate what I believed. The interview was parsed by Christian critics who accused me of becoming worldly. But I was just nervous. So mainstream forces were pushing me to conform to their expectations, and Christian critics were trying to pull me into their camp. I had to finally accept that there just wasn't a category for what God was calling me to do. I wasn't making gospel music or Christian music, but it contrasted with the majority of mainstream music as well. In a twist of irony, I realized I'd become what I had always been, an outsider, a misfit, an anomaly. I had the title for my next album. The record represented the final stage of my evolution as an artist. I was no longer trying to fit into the boxes of the prisons that other artists lived in. I wasn't working to impress the gatekeepers and kingmakers in the Christian or mainstream worlds. They both were building lesser kingdoms, and I was going to seek a greater one, God's kingdom. The Anomaly album was almost completely autobiographical. It walked people through the story God had written through my life since birth, and the place He had finally brought me to. The opening track, Outsiders, summed it all up. Now I realize that I'm free, and I realize that I am me, and I found that I'm not alone, because there's plenty of people like me.
The JWMI MBA program allows so much flexibility.
One of the things that I've
Now I realize that I'm free, and I realize that I'm me. And I found out that I'm not alone, because there's plenty of people like me. That's right, there's plenty of people like me. All love me, despite me, and all unashamed and all unafraid to speak out for what we might see. I felt liberated as I waited to perform at the Best Buy Theater that night. The long journey that led me to this moment was covered in God's fingerprints. It's easy, of course, to recognize God's presence in the good times. My conversion night in Atlanta, meeting my wife, launching Reach Records, and the ongoing success of the music. But I now realize God has been there on the darkest nights of my life too. God didn't walk out the door when my dad did. As a child in Southeast San Diego struggling to fit in, God showed up in Big Mama's prayers and Brother Santiago's sermons. During my identity crisis at college, and while I sat outside the women's clinic, God was waiting for me to come to my senses. As I lay sleeping after trying to overdose on pills, God stood watch. When I checked into rehab, God revealed Himself through Bible passages and crayon scribblings. He came to me through the words of James White and Charles Spurgeon and Frederick Douglass and Nancy Pearcey and Andy Crouch. When the critic's words cut deep, God showed up in the wisdom of my life and the kind words of a pastor friend. Someone told me recently that people are like tree trunks. They have many rings inside that mark what they once were. Staring into the mirror backstage at that Manhattan theater, I asked the question that had been plaguing me since my birth. Who is LECREA? Who is he really? Was I the rebel kid? The lost college student who just wanted to be accepted? The legalistic man who battled self-righteousness? Was I a husband or a father or a hip-hop artist? Like a tree trunk, all those people were a part of me. They are a part of me. But more than anything, LECREA is a child who is unconditionally loved by God. I am a sinner who has been rescued by God from my brokenness and called to glorify the one who has never left my side. That's who LECREA is, and that's who I'll always be. Before I took the stage, there was only one thing left to do. I gathered up our team to pray like we always do before performing. Father, allow us to use our gifts to paint an accurate picture of your creativity and your goodness tonight. Help us to stay out of the way of your will being done. We want to play a role, but we don't want to take the lead. We are extras in your movie, but not the star of this show. May we be humble. May we be grateful. May we be unashamed. Amen. And that's the end of chapter 11. We're almost there. We got one final chapter. The epilogue. Alright. We're almost there. You read the epilogue? And that's it. Okay. I used to wonder that I would live for it till I found that I would die found the reason I'm alive for. I'm only here to help people turn the lights on. You can't listen to the radio, LECREA, he said. You're a Christian. Those were the words of a 12-year-old named Dante that I mentored in Binghamton. I had given him some of my music. It was his first serious introduction to God and Jesus and faith. One day, I picked him up, and when he jumped in my car, young Deezy was playing on the radio. His head snapped to the side, and that's when he told me I wasn't supposed to listen to secular music. I asked him what he was talking about, and he explained that Christians had to stop listening to worldly music. He said that Christians should only listen to Christian music. He could listen to secular stuff because he wasn't a Christian, but I shouldn't. We kept talking, and he told me that he thought Christians had to follow a list of do's and don'ts to keep God from getting mad. Wait, I interrupted. You believe that in order for God to love you, you have to stop doing certain things and start doing other things. His view of Christianity was mainly coming from me and my music. Somehow he had gotten the idea that following Jesus was all about what he did, not who he trusted. He assumed that Christian music was just for Christians and secular music was just for non-Christians. In his mind, the two genres and audiences should remain separate. I've never forgotten that conversation, and it was one of the catalysts of rethinking the music. Most of the non-Christians and many of the Christians I know see the world like Dante did, like I once did. They think they view the world through a single lens. But really, they are looking through bifocals. Half the world is sacred, holy, or good, and half the world is secular, unholy, or evil. But when we see the world through a divided lens, we can easily end up living divided lives. We act one way in church or any other sacred space. Then we act another way when we're out with our friends in secular spaces. And the result is that the things of God rarely come into contact with or influence the world. The solution to this problem is to begin to develop a biblical worldview. While nearly 80% of all Americans claim to be Christian, only 9% have a biblical worldview. If you are a follower of Jesus, this should frighten you, because more than likely you're in the majority and probably don't even realize it. So what is a biblical worldview, and how should it change the way we live? A biblical worldview is, by definition, rooted in Scripture. So we begin at the beginning. The first chapter of the book of Genesis is a familiar story of a God that creates, of a serpent that tempts, and of two humans who commit the first sin. Here we find the basic elements of a biblical worldview. God creates all things. So we know there is a single sovereign, transcendent, all-powerful God who is creative and artistic. Because he declares his creation good, we know that matter matters. The physical world is not just an intermediate place where we exist until we die or go somewhere. God creates humans in his image. This means that every person is uniquely valuable. They are not just objects to be used for pleasure or progress. Every person is the object of God's love, and therefore they should be treated with dignity and respect. Despite having God's image, the first humans disobeyed God. The story of Adam and Eve eating the forbidden fruit is my story, and your story too. We all reject God's rightful rule over the world, disobeying his wishes for our lives. Sin leads to brokenness between humans and God, each other, and themselves. If you want to know what is wrong with the world, the answer is always sin. God promises that one day the serpent that tempted Adam and Eve will be crushed. This reminds us that while we should not minimize or ignore sin, we do not live in despair. We have hope. God has not abandoned his children, his creation. He sent Christ to crush the serpent. When Jesus lives in us, we have the same power to stomp out the sin that the serpent has brought into the world. These elements remind us that the world God created is good. Things aren't inherently evil or bad, but they have been tainted with sin. Because of Jesus, we don't need to see culture as something to be avoided. It is something to be engaged. We cannot stop something you're running away from. You can't influence something you never encountered. A good example of biblical worldview is Daniel. I like Daniel. If he were alive now, we'd probably hang out. In the Bible, Daniel was an advisor to a king named Nebuchadnezzar. Working for the king was a pretty good gig. But things got weird when the king had some crazy dreams. Nebuchadnezzar wanted to know what they meant, so he summoned his advisors. In those days, interpreting dreams was a big in practice. If Daniel was wearing bifocals, he would have seen this as a secular action, an evil action, something that people who serve God didn't do. But Daniel didn't see the world like that. He knew that, as the psalmist would later write, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. So Daniel went to God, and God told him what the dreams meant. When Daniel interpreted King Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, the king was impressed and appointed Daniel his chief advisor. Now, if Daniel were living in our world, he might have turned down the job and enrolled in seminary. But he didn't, because he saw this secular job as part of his sacred calling, and because he didn't see the world as divided, he took the job and was able to speak godly wisdom into Nebuchadnezzar's life. This has changed the way I do music. There is no such thing as Christian rap and secular rap. Only people can become Christians. Music can't accept Jesus into its heart. So I am not trying to make Christian music or secular music. I'm just making music. Hip-hop, like all music, is a good thing. I can use it for evil by filling it with violence and misogyny and profanity. Or I can use it to glorify God. Every song I write doesn't have to have the gospel spelled out or quote scriptures so that people will know I love Jesus. My goal is just to use my gifts to produce great art that tells the truth about the world. If I see the world through a biblical lens, the music will naturally paint a picture that serves people and honors God. The same is true for you. If you are a politician and you don't have a secular job, if you are a computer programmer, you don't have a secular job. The term secular is defined as an attitude, activity, or thing that has no religious or spiritual basis. But there's nothing on the planet that God isn't ruling over. Everything a believer touches and uses in a way that honors God is, in a sense, no longer secular. We all bring our sacred callings into a world that God created and called good, and that has been tainted by sin. But where God wants to use us to impact for His glory. What is true for a job is true for everything in the world that God has called good. Dancing is good, movies are good, music is good. The hearts of men, however, have been tainted by sin. So the way we use good things can be bad. Some Christians have talked about sex like it is inherently bad. You can use it for evil by becoming a prostitute, but you can also use it for good by enjoying the gift of sex in the context of marriage. If I stab you with a knife, that's evil, but I can also use that knife to carve a Thanksgiving turkey for a family in need. Rather than thinking about the world in the categories of simply good and evil, a biblical worldview helps us think in the categories of good and redeemable. You and I may come from different backgrounds and live in different cities and have different jobs and be separated in age by decades, but we have the same calling, to be instruments of God's redemptive power in the world. The Apostle Paul wrote, We are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. The word for workmanship is poema. We are God's poem to the world. A poem articulates the heart, the mind, and the character of the poet. Your calling may not be to write music, or produce music, or sing music, but that's okay. You are music. You're God's music, and God doesn't just want to break records and top charts with you. He wants to change lives in industries and society. By God's grace, I'm going to keep making the music as long as I have air in my lungs. But my prayer is that you'll make music too. Maybe not with your voice, and maybe not on the stage, but hopefully with your life. May God get glory from the music we create. Keep on creating. And that is the end of Unashamed by LECREA. Whew. This was our final part in the book. That is the end of the epilogue. 6 parts. And I'm glad that he brought his testimony into this book. But writing-wise, I'm not a huge fan of how he writes it. I mean, I get it. He's writing it like a rapper. But if you're an author of a book, I mean, there is some language that does. I'm glad that that makes it somewhat common sense. But the way he writes some of it makes it sound like a rapper wrote the book, which is what he is. He's a Christian rapper. Or I'm not sure if he considers himself a Christian rapper, but anywho, it's not a horrible book. If this book has helped you, has changed you for the better, if you like rappers, if you like music, I highly recommend this book to you. Again, you can hear his music on Spotify or YouTube or wherever you listen to your music. Go ahead and give a listen to his music because some of his stuff is really good. So, our next book, I'm hoping to get back to before we end up moving is I'm hoping to get back to. Hang on 1 second. Oh, that's right. Ah, there it is. Ruin and Rising. So that will be our next book for me to work on. Again, I hope you all enjoyed this book. It's a pretty quick read. I think it's under 200 pages, which is not a bad deal. So yeah, it's a very quick book. So I hope you all enjoyed the book. Me reading this to you. I had fun doing this with you guys. If you guys want to hear me read more books to you guys, please like and subscribe down below and hit the bell icon for more videos to come. Until then, I'm the Epileptic Explorer, and I hope you all have a fantastic afternoon.